Mid-October 1444. On an overcast and cold early winter day, Ottoman soldiers on horseback are riding up and down the opposite banks of the Bosphorus. The tall buildings of Constantinople, the enfeebled capital of the once mighty Roman Empire, is in view a very short distance to the south. The head man of one party halts his mount and waits for his counterpart on the far bank to follow his action. At a signal, his engineers approach from their hiding spot, and once finished surveying the coastline, they plant the flags in the damp soil, marking the spot as the correct point of the strait. Soldiers emerge from the tree line on the western side and form up into ordered units. Their officers have them leave aisles between the infantry squares, and these allow for artillery to advance through and up to the bank, carefully mounted and secured by army cannoneers. The number of men on the western side are far greater than those on the east for the moment, and as the engineers are putting the finishing touches to the artillery emplacements, the commander of this Ottoman operation, Halil Pasha, looks up from his post on the European bank and sees the Crusader blockade fleet. These 6 ships, under the command of Valorin de Wevrin and his mixed crewmen of Burgundians, Venetians and Ragusans, are watching the proceedings with ever-mounting apprehension and unease. The Ottomans on the western bank call the site they have chosen Rumeli Hisar, and they stay close to the castle constructed by their forebears a half-century earlier during a failed siege of Constantinople. What weighs on the thoughts of the Crusaders is that Rumeli Hisar and its corresponding point on the east side, Anadolu Hisar, is the narrowest section on the Bosphorus. The two banks are only 750 meters apart, and he is not sure whether he will be able to stop them making a crossing. That evening, the Burgundian commander Wevrin travels to the court of Constantinople, where Emperor John VIII Palaeologos tells him with regret that he cannot deploy men in any kind of numbers that would challenge the Ottoman force. The 2 Venetian ships he has provided already risks bringing the now spectral Byzantine Empire into a conflict that it will have little chance of surviving. Thus, Wevrin is left with the impossible task of stopping the massive Ottoman crossing. The rhythm of modern life can burden any of us with stress and anxiety. Heavy workloads and technology keeps us switched on 24/7, and as we face economic hardship, cost of living, the well-being and mental health of all of us is impacted. I believe that therapy can help connect with yourself to be a happier, healthier person in your mind, which is where our sponsor BetterHelp is a great asset. BetterHelp is a platform that makes therapy accessible to everyone using technology. Therapy has changed my own life over the past couple of years. With BetterHelp, you don't need to plan visits, call therapist offices, or check if it works with your insurance. It's all done online. You sign up and you take a quiz that quickly shows where you're at mentally and what you need to work on, how you want to change. Then the platform matches you to a therapist in their huge network of tens of thousands of licensed therapists. From there, you start communicating with your therapist through texting, phone calls, or video calls. All of the scheduling is done on the platform, and if you feel that your therapist isn't a good fit, you can easily switch to a different one with a click of a button. Our mental health is just as important as our physical health, so we should make the same effort to keep our minds healthy. And BetterHelp's mission is to make this possible for everyone. There's a link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/HistoryMarche. When you click that link, you get 10% off your first month, so you can try it out at a discount and see if it works for you. And you can cancel at any time. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. The day after meeting with the Emperor, Wevrin watches as Sultan Murad II, recently returned from retirement at the behest of his son and viziers, arrives on the eastern side of the Bosphorus and enters the bright tent that his innumerable slaves have erected for him. He brings with him 4,000 men, as well as additional artillery, which he emplaces at Anadolu Hisar. The day following, transport barges arrive from the northern end of the strait, and Wavrin moves to intercept them. The Crusaders see with unmitigated fury that it is the Genoese who are assisting the Sultan, supplying him not only with the ships, but also the cannon that are protecting his forces. The effectiveness of the Ottoman strategy becomes immediately apparent. Artillery provides enfilading fire to any passing ships, around 300 meters from each bank. This makes it impossible for the Crusader galleys to row along the edges of the strait, keeping them in its middle where the current is rushing strongly against them. Helped by the covering fire, most of the Ottoman transports evade the Crusader ships. As they try to chase the transports towards either the east or west bank, the land cannons open fire on the fragile timbers of the Crusader craft. Wavrin is forced to withdraw under heavy bombardment, and transports resume ferrying the Janissaries unimpeded. Night falls, and the Crusaders have no backup plan or additional options. The Ottoman transports continue the next day, and by the next night the Sultan himself embarks on a transport to meet with his vizier on the European side. Wavrin sees an opportunity to end the Ottoman effort in one fell swoop, and he launches a last effort with his exhausted crews and splintered ships. The wind whips up behind the Sultan's transport, while the galleys speed towards him. The Ottoman head gunner, Saruka, freely fires all of his artillery to provide cover to the Sultan. The wind is such that the Crusaders have little control over their craft, and the guns make their greatest impact yet, severely damaging one of Emperor John's galleys, and then sinking the other. Wavrin is forced to watch as Murad rides his horse onto the shore of Europe and is welcomed by Halil Pasha. Once the Sultan is safely across and en route to the Ottoman capital of Edirne, a Turkish commander signals to Wavrin for a conference under the flag of truce. Reluctantly, the Burgundian accepts the invitation. The Turk informs Wavrin that the King of Hungary has broken his word and sacred treaty signed with the Sultan only weeks previously, and that Murad would, in consequence, do battle with him. Brandishing his sword, the commander tells Wavrin in no uncertain terms that by it the Ottomans would be victorious. The Sultan and his army now move north, leaving the broken Crusader blockade and the shell of Constantinople behind in the dim autumn twilight. The cause of Sultan Murad's haste to reach Edirne was the approach of an army commanded by the young king, Wladislas of Poland and Hungary, and his talismanic general, John Hunyadi. After decades traveling as a sellsword, studying the welfare of Renaissance Italy and Hussite Bohemia, as well as fighting on the southern borders against a seemingly unstoppable Ottoman machine, Hunyadi had recently scored major victories against armies many times the size of his own. These had both secured the throne of Hungary for Wladislas, as well as shocking the similarly capable Sultan Murad. In September 1442, Hunyadi defeated a third Ottoman army in the course of a single year, in the Yalamitsa Valley, south of the Carpathians, besting a force of 70,000 under the command of Begler Bey Sahabeddin, the Beyler Bey of Rumelia, and personal appointment of the Sultan. These victories filled the nearby Christian kingdoms with hope. The despot of Serbia, Juraj Brankovic, had pledged allegiance to Wladislas, bringing his superior heavy cavalry to the cause, and other powers were now keen to follow his example. The Ottomans had been in the ascendancy in Europe for decades. Could their advance be stopped, or perhaps reversed, they wondered. This was especially on the mind of Pope Eugene IV, who had negotiated a new union between the Catholic and Orthodox churches in 1439. In the thoughts of the papacy, a liberated Balkans would open the land route by which Eastern and Western Christendom could be physically joined once more. A crusade to expel the Ottomans was declared in January 1443. The Hungarians officially declared war that spring. Troops from across Europe came by land and sea to join the enterprise. The near 27,000-strong Crusader army marched south with the Ottoman capital of Edirne as its major objective. Hunyadi had raised his own force of mostly Czech Hussite mercenaries, said to number 10,000, which cost him over 30,000 florins, an enormous sum in those days. The crusade was not merely depending on its own mettle and fortitude to carry the day. A winter campaign had been deliberately chosen to make it difficult for Sultan Murad to raise his mass levies, and the Italian states of Venice and Genoa had undertaken to provide seaborne supplies and blockade the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Strait to Ottoman forces coming from Anatolia. In addition to these preparations, the Crusaders were also in contact with Ibrahim Bey of Karaman, who had previously allied with the Hungarians against Murad in the 1420s. Ibrahim launched a campaign in the east to force Murad to fight a war on two fronts. Meanwhile, Wladislas, Hunyadi, and Juraj Branković's campaign in late 1443 had a strong start, with victories in a series of battles, inflicting 6,000 casualties on the Ottomans at Niš. They then moved on and occupied Sofia. A month later, Hunyadi's attempt to wrong-foot the Ottomans fell short, when the Crusaders arrived at the Zlatitsa Pass to find a formidable army under the command of the Sultan himself on guard. Attempts to storm the stronghold proved too costly, and the Crusaders effected a retreat. It was a terrible setback to the cause. Only Hunyadi's and Branković's command saved the army from annihilation during the march in the freezing December mountains. A pre-planned counterattack on the Ottomans who had followed them to the Kunovica Pass in January 1444 raised spirits. The Crusaders waited in ambush at night, located the Ottoman camp and looted all of its supplies. The Sultan's son-in-law and brother to the Grand Vizier, Mahmud Bey, was captured in the night battle. Returning to their lands, the victory at Kunovica was used by the Crusaders to spread the impression that they had been successful in their campaign, despite not achieving decisive victory. The army reached Belgrade on the 22nd of January, and then the greater part of the survivors arrived in Buda at the start of February. Tales began to be told all around the kingdom and far beyond of the heroic and invincible Hunyadi, with the 20-year-old King Wladislas noticing that he was relegated by the multitudes to a supporting role in his own campaign. But Sultan Murad had his own concerns to contend with. He failed to destroy the Crusader forces in the field, which emboldened others like Iskender Bey, Constantine Drogus, and Ibrahim Bey to follow their lead, and sensed that the Ottoman kingdom was in a state of acute vulnerability. Murad could have dealt with these threats one after the other, but should a Crusader army consisting of troops from Hungary, Poland, Serbia, as well as forces from even further afield, return in the spring, cut off the Bosphorus and Dardanelles with a blockade, and engage in another prolonged campaign, the Ottoman presence in Europe would be threatened. The Sultan thus embarked on a diplomatic offensive, attempting to stave off the threat from Wladislas's combined kingdoms of Poland and Hungary without the burden of yet another costly campaign. The Sultan approached Juraj Branković, who was in fact Murad's father-in-law, with the offer to rule a restored Serbia should Branković be able to convince his allies to sign a peace treaty. Branković saw what seemed to be a generous offer, and he approached Hunyadi, offering all of his own lands in the Hungarian kingdom should Hunyadi support the cessation of hostilities. Hunyadi also agreed to these terms, and so all that was left was to convince young King Wladislas to give his assent. Murad's terms to Wladislas were generous in the extreme. The Sultan repeated his promise to withdraw Ottoman forces from Serbia, as well as pay 100,000 gold florins to Wladislas as tribute to keep the peace for 10 years. As if that was not enough, Murad also pledged to send 30,000 troops to aid Wladislas in the event of future conflicts. When Ottoman representatives arrived in Hungary on the first day of August 1444, there was surprise and notable support for the peace. Hunyadi and Branković counselled signing the treaty, and Wladislas initially seemed amenable. The Hungarian nobility supported peace, for the kingdom had been racked by civil war for years. The Polish nobility also urged Wladislas to accept the treaty. Polish realms were suffering raids from Tatars, and the nobles believed that the Ottoman army Murad had offered could be put to use against them. However, the one Crusader leader set against the peace was Giuliano Cesarini, the papal legate, and he counselled Wladislas not to trust the word of the Sultan. He reminded everyone attending the meeting that the Pope and the Venetians had spent tens of thousands of florins to equip a navy to support the liberation of the Balkans, and they stood to lose much if the war did not proceed that year. Cesarini stressed that the reunification of the Eastern and Western churches remained the primary objective of Pope Eugene IV, and that the land route to Constantinople represented the greatest hope for the salvation of all Christendom. Wladislas, still keen to portray himself as a hero of the Church and his kingdoms of Poland and Hungary, played a double game, placating Cesarini that he had no intention of making peace with the Sultan, and on the other, remaining in conference with Ottoman plenipotentiaries to establish the final details of the peace. On the 4th of August, Wladislas gave a public oath before the nobility not to honour any peace signed with the Sultan. But then on the 15th, he had Hunyadi represent him at the signing of the treaty in Oradea. Though Wladislas's army was still mustering at Szeged, news of the peace was greeted with consternation in the lands which were opposed to the Ottomans, especially those in outright rebellion, and Wladislas's allies were thrown into confusion. Sultan Murad had returned to Anatolia to engage Ibrahim Bey almost a month before, in mid-June, and on seeing the Sultan he had believed defeated by the Crusaders earlier that winter, Ibrahim Bey lost all of his resolve. He offered a truce to Murad, who accepted it grudgingly. Thinking peace thus established on both the eastern and western front, the 40-year-old Sultan Murad abdicated in favour of his son, Mehmet, who would become known to history as the Conqueror. Murad remained in Anatolia, while the 14-year-old Mehmet ruled from Edirne with the assistance of Halil Pasha. In Serbia and Hungary, the Ottomans fulfilled their promised withdrawal, and Branković and Hunyadi occupied their new lands, though Hunyadi remained with the king. Cesarini continued to lobby Wladislas to renew hostilities, and despite the popularity of the peace in both Hungary and Poland, there was much he had to say that swayed the young monarch. Reminding Wladislas of his oaths to God and the papacy, he pointed to the fact that Ibrahim Bey was fighting the Sultan in Anatolia, and there was also a fleet now approaching the straits between Europe and Asia, raised at great expense and danger to the Venetians, Papacy, Ragusans, and Burgundians. What would the king's reputation be if he were to desert his allies to the retribution of the Ottomans? Finally, Cesarini made the very convincing argument that Sultan Murad's generosity was undoubtedly a signal of a deeply weakened, even desperate position. There would never be a greater chance to end the Ottoman advance in Europe forever. The legate's arguments won over Wladislas, and he made the decision to march. In mid-September, the Crusader army moved south, Hunyadi loyally leading it, though this time he and Wladislas were without Serbian support. Now installed in his capital, Smederevo, Juraj Brankovic refused to join them, and the loss of his heavy cavalry and infantry were a serious blow to the capabilities of the Crusaders. Vlad Dracul of Wallachia warned Wladislas of the strength of Murad's army, but he nevertheless sent a contingent commanded by his son, Mircea II, to join the campaign. Moving out from Orshova on the 18th, the Crusaders and their 2,000 wagons had occupied the town of Vidin by the 31st, but they did not try to invest its fortress. From there, they followed the river east to Leskovets and Nicopolis, where they once again took control of the town, but not the fortress. It was here, around the 20th of October, that the Wallachians joined the campaign, and word reached them that Murad had cast off his retirement and crossed the Bosphorus 2 days earlier. After a Crusader detachment was defeated by an Ottoman force north of the Shipka Pass, Wladislas and Hunyadi moved east toward the Black Sea coast, where they hoped to link up with the fleet that had just passed through the Bosphorus Strait and find another means to cross the mountains south to the plain of Edirne. Murad, meanwhile, moved north to Edirne, his presence stabilizing an Ottoman leadership one step short of full-blown panic. He learned that the Crusaders were heading east, fighting a series of engagements before arriving at the town of Varna, where they dug in and made camp. On the 4th of November, Murad was at Aitos, and here he was joined by the forces of Sehabedin, bringing his host to at least twice, if not 3 times, the size of the Crusaders. The showdown took place a week later, on the 11th of November. Hunyadi anchored his left to the marshlands adjacent to Lake Varna, with the town and fortress and the Black Sea shoreline at his army's back. Hunyadi commanded the left flank in conjunction with Michael Szilágyi, his captain and brother-in-law. Units of Transylvanians and Hunyadi's forces were placed on the furthest reaches of this side. Wladislas and his men were slightly behind the front line in the center of the army, though mostly Hungarian and a several hundred-strong Polish cavalry contingent acted as the king's bodyguard. There was also likely a reserve or mobile support force in and around the center of the line. The Crusader right wing was comprised of the Wallachians under the command of Vlad Dracul's son Mircea, along with Cesarini commanding the Papal Volunteers, Bosnians, and additional Hungarians. Unlike the Crusaders' left flank, this right wing consisted of heavy armored cavalry, and its objective was to maintain a defense against the Ottoman forces that might attempt to fall upon its exposed sides. Hunyadi's left wing was lighter and intended to work as an offensive force. The sizable wagon tabor was arrayed behind the forward companies in a curved line, with artillery as well as arquebus firearms and crossbows. By setting his lines in front of the wagon fort, Hunyadi showed an intent to attack rather than passively defend, or at least lure the huge Ottoman army into an offensive on the mobile stronghold. Opposite the Crusader right wing, the Sultan placed the Ottoman army of Rumelia, well experienced at fighting European armies, under the command of Sehabedin. Murad himself had an elevated position in the rear, surrounded by a trench and bulwark, lined with iron-tipped stakes and policed by his most formidable janissaries. 2 separate formations of light infantry Azabs were stationed either side of the Sultan's palisade. On the Ottoman right wing, Anatolian troops commanded by Gayagu Karacha bin Abdullah Pasha were positioned alongside Suleiman Bey, who led the soldiers of Edirne. All told, the Ottomans fielded around 40,000 troops. The Crusaders, meanwhile, stood at no more than 23,000 strong. Though they were outnumbered, Hunyadi and Wladislas had a plan to negate Ottoman numbers. Their right wing appeared exposed, but on the morning of the 11th of November, they marched their forces forward to anchor their flank on wood-covered hillside, which was also laden with thick bramble undergrowth. This was ground not suited to cavalry charges, and so with Lake Varna and marshland to their left and thick brush on their right, Hunyadi thought that the Ottoman advantage would be abated by the narrow field of fighting. Furthermore, the 2-mile distance from the shoreline and the presence of the wagon lager also made it improbable that the Crusader army could be pinned against the sea and wiped out on the beach. The morning of the battle was said to have been clear, but sometime during the morning the winds blowing from the west were howling. The pennants, standards and coats of arms of both armies were flung out straight in the breeze. Combined with the polished suits of armor, the resplendent horses and the massed ranks of infantry, the sight was mesmerizing, its magnificence belying the awful misery that would soon descend on the souls present in their tens of thousands. On command, the central formation of the Ottoman Azabs advanced toward the Crusader line, followed by the Anatolians at a slower pace. Stopping once they came into range, the Azabs unleashed their arrow volleys meant to soften up the enemy. Many among the Crusaders were accustomed to such tactics and braced themselves for an arrow skirmish. But a force of Saxon knights unexpectedly charged forward, perhaps unable to hold their nerve. Moving against the Anatolian formations in the Ottoman center, they broke through infantry Azabs before engaging the cavalry behind them. The Anatolians, though more numerous, took a beating from the armored Saxon knights, but managed to slow down their charge. The impetuous and insubordinate action by the Saxons had a knock-on effect across the battlefield. Several units from the Ottoman right moved in to aid the Anatolians in the center, while Karaka Bey advanced with the rest of the Ottoman right wing to prevent other Crusader companies from joining the push of the Saxons. Michael Silagi led his own company in conjunction with Hunyadi's force in an advance on Karaka Bey, attempting to alleviate the pressure on the Saxons, who were enjoying some progress but were now in danger of envelopment. To their right again, the Wallachian cavalry charged across the field to engage the strong force of Suleiman Bey, thus providing a shield for Silagi to do his work. While the Crusader offensive on the left wing went into high gear, and the battlefield resounded with the war cries mingled with the drums and the trumpets of the bandsmen, the far side of the plain at this moment erupted in tandem. Murad and his generals had scorned the harsh terrain on the hills and sent Azabs and tough Rumelian cavalry through the woods and slopes to launch an offensive on the Crusaders' right wing. It was a gamble, for it meant that the infantry and cavalry were forced to travel along narrow tracks rather than in wide formations. If they were turned about by the Crusader defense, an orderly retreat would be next to impossible. The heavy cavalry on the Crusader right, now weakened after Mircea and the Wallachians departed to aid the left wing, came under attack from archers on the hillside. At this point, the Ottoman companies of the left wing moved in a general advance, 3 on the plain and 1 on the very far side through the wooded hills. The 3 battles moving forward on the plain ran into royal units of Wladislas, and they were dismayed to find that their weapons had little effect against the armoured knights and their mounts. Nevertheless, casting away their swords, they instead made use of heavy melee weapons, mainly maces and clubs. From the bank of the lake and right across the plain to the hills, the fighting raged along the line. The Ottoman commander, Davud Bey, on the left, seemed to be nearing a breakthrough when his regiment charged from the hillside on the Crusader right and put a number of Crusader companies there to flight. Cesarini, finding himself in the battle he so ardently prayed and campaigned for, remained in place while the majority of his Crusaders fell back. The Pope's man defended the Holy Banner with a scant 200 men. While these remnants held, other Ottoman units next fell upon the wagon train. Heavy fighting ensued as the Crusader cannon and musket fire tore through the Ottoman formations. Hunyadi saw the massive attack from his position and moved to relieve the hard-pressed right flank. There, the Sultan's men fought hard, eventually overturning and destroying some of the tabors. This action took time, however, and it was not long before the galloping Hunyadi smashed into the advancing Ottomans. Momentarily stopping the enemy advance, Hunyadi only brought with him a portion of the reserve and could only do so much. Davud Bey soon launched a counterattack. Ottoman numbers were such that Hunyadi had to withdraw and shelter in the Battle of King Wladislas. The desperate units on the Crusader right wing were forced to hold on while the fighting on the opposite side of the field came to a conclusion. It was there on the Crusader left that the Anatolian sections of the Ottoman army broke, the majority falling back, while Karaka Bey made a last-ditch frontal charge with his remaining troops. He and his men were killed amidst the mass of Crusader forces. Hunyadi cried to the king that they only needed to disrupt the Ottoman left, and the day would be theirs. Wladislas and Hunyadi now put all of their forces into the attack on Sehabedin and Davud Bey. The outcome of the battle and the fate of the Crusader army rested on the success of their attack. Both Ottoman commanders and their men absorbed the charge with fortitude and fought bravely, but soon the weight of the Crusader army began to tell on the fatigued Azabs and their cavalry, and the Ottoman left began to fall back. The menace of withdrawing through the woods and brambles of the hills became palpable reality when the panicking infantry began streaming away, panicked horses trampling men, riders entangled in the thick vegetation, all adding to the chaos. Though a good portion of the Ottoman line attempted to make their stand, the rout became general across the plain, and Hunyadi and Wladislas, along with their commanders, led the charge, chasing them from the field. The butchery was widespread, knights on armoured horses running down the lightly armoured Ottomans, slashing, cutting, executing in cold blood. After reaching the Ottoman camp and Murad's quarters, Hunyadi and Wladislas had them come about, ride back and regroup at the wagon lager. The Crusade leadership was aware that the enemy was not yet completely defeated, despite the exultation of clearing the attacking forces back up the hill. Once back behind friendly lines, Hunyadi and Wladislas pensively watched the crest of the hill in front while their men refreshed themselves. Sure enough, from their vantage point on top of the wagon fort, they saw the unmistakable movement and then the ominous sound of drums. Murad had deployed his own units, the elite Janissaries. These infantry likely numbered thousands of well-trained and amply equipped men. In this, they were equal to half the size of the remaining Crusader force, who had already fought and won a hard battle that day. By the afternoon, a maelstrom of wind whipped in as the exhausted Crusaders lined up to face the Sultan's elite infantry, who were well rested, fed, and motivated after watching the course of the fighting. The Janissaries halted within range of the Tiber, still slightly elevated, and began loosing arrows in their thousands on the Crusaders. Their position untenable and a retreat impossible, the Crusaders charged. The Janissaries dropped their bows and formed up to receive the charge. Those with arquebuses fired when the oncoming cavalry came into range, and then a tremendous hand-to-hand combat began. The fighting became so thick and so frantic that comrades could not recognize one another. At one point, Hunyadi pierced into the Turkish formation without realizing that he was cut off from the rest of the Crusader force. Wladislas and his retinue had to cut their way to return him to the fold. As evening approached, with the result in the balance, Murad himself appeared in the line, attempting to instill some belief in his men that they could overcome the seemingly immovable Crusaders. But it was not to be, for the knights and infantry, inch by inch and then foot by foot, started to lever the Ottoman line back. And then it was the turn of the Janissaries to face desertions and withdrawals. Piecemeal at first, soon whole units and then companies were fleeing back toward the sanctuary of Murad's headquarters. The Sultan retreated as well, taking his place atop his mount behind the palisade, and watched as his army fell apart for the second time that day. Murad refused his commander's pleas to make an escape, willing to meet his fate in whatever form it descended upon him. While the Crusader army exulted in the deliverance of a miracle, Hunyadi turned to Wladislas and told him that the day was theirs. They had defeated the Ottoman Sultan in open battle, besting a force multiple times their size. The young king reveled in the moment, breathless enervation crossed with buoyant, floating ecstasy. Then the chants of his Hungarian barons, their blood-streaked faces crying out in joy. They called to him to charge on the Sultan's own tent, to finish what they had begun and truly put an end to the menace of the sons of Osman. Wladislas heard them and raised his arm in agreement. Hunyadi advised him not to charge, but the king took a fresh lance and fixed his reins. After years of challenge from pretenders and then the shadow of Hunyadi's luster, Wladislas called in a high voice on several hundred of his Polish and Hungarian attendants and rode up the hill. Hunyadi watched him go. The majority of Wladislas's troops did not see what happened next. Wladislas's force crashed into the outer perimeter of the Sultan's tent. They had already bested the elite frontline soldiers of the Janissary Corps, but there were regiments of fresh guards stationed behind the razor-sharp iron and timber palisade, a deep trench and an earthen bulwark constructed behind that. Even the Ottoman chroniclers praised Wladislas's bravery, fighting skill, and his ferocity. But the charge inevitably floundered at the gate of Murad's encampment. The horses could not pass through the single entrance, where Sultan's guards had massed themselves with long spears. The hundreds of mounted Crusaders pressed together at its front, creating a nightmarish bottleneck. The static knights were easy targets for the Ottomans manning the palisades, who showered them with spears, arrows, and any other missiles that came to hand, while the better armed fired arquebuses. Eventually, Ottoman cannons were deployed. Once they began firing, they ripped through the Crusader cavalry. It was a terrible carnage, a battle as furious in every way as the fighting earlier in the day. Somehow, through sheer force of will and fortune, Wladislas, carrying a scimitar rent from the hand of his enemies, made it past the lethal barriers and the baying, stabbing guards. He rode directly at Murad, who was now visible on his mount. Eyes on the fellow monarch, his own moment of ascendancy mere seconds away, Wladislas did not see the approach of one of Murad's bodyguards, nor the axe that he used to cut the legs of Wladislas's mount. The king smashed to the ground, the weight of his screaming and thrashing horse crumpling him. In the worst of all possible places, Wladislas, king of Hungary and Poland, was at the mercy of his enemy, but neither Murad nor his retainers had time to absorb the moment. Instead, with hundreds of Wladislas's men still trying to fight their way inside the compound, the king was killed in short order, his head detached from his body. Once Murad had ensured that it was indeed Wladislas that lay dead before him, the head was mounted on a spear and held aloft for all of his remaining men to behold. The sight rallied the Ottomans, who signalled to the enemy what became of Wladislas. This broke the will of the attacking Crusaders. Hunyadi had also received word by the onset of night. He moved north into the mountains, attempting to regroup as much of his force as he could, but with little success. Meanwhile, the men manning the Tabor palisade, still unaware of what had happened, believed that the Crusaders had carried the day, and they moved the wagons into a square formation for the night to wait for Hunyadi's and Wladislas's return. Most of the Crusader stragglers lost their way in the mountains, finding themselves at an impassable ravine and pursued by reinvigorated Ottoman cavalry. Several thousand lost their lives there. Murad, still not certain that he had won the battle after losing so many of his men, approached the Tabor the next day with his army and displayed the head of Wladislas. Seeing that they were without either Hunyadi or their king, the defenders of the Tabor gave way with little fight as the Ottomans rode in and set light to it. Many of them were killed, and many more taken prisoner. Now assured that he had prevailed, Murad gave thanks and surveyed the plain where tens of thousands of men from both sides lay after a day of the most extreme brutality. He rode back to Edirne to announce his victory and to begin his second reign. The greatest chance that the kingdoms of Eastern Europe had to expel the Ottomans from Europe had passed. While Poland and Hungary were thrown into crisis by the death of their young king, Hunyadi had lived, and he spent the coming years attempting to win over the papacy and the Western states in sponsoring a new campaign. He died of the plague 12 years later, still fighting. By that time, Murad's son Mehmet had inherited the Ottoman throne and earned his sobriquet, the Conqueror. A new age had dawned across Europe and the Middle East.
If you stayed around this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. You can also support us on Patreon and get ad-free early access to our videos for as little as $1, or by clicking the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.